So we've gone through the history of windows, we've gone through some practical issues. Now we're going to be talking about the significance and some of the more legal bits and pieces and the planning bits. So I'm going to hand straight over to Tom, who's going to take us through the whole world of significance. Tom.
If you're lucky, and if any of you fall asleep, I'm watching. Before I start this on significance, can I just mention in your packs the people I work for, the Towie Centre in Carmarthenshire, all about training, especially for window repairs, joinery repairs. Unfortunately, it means you'd be dealing with me, but that might be a good thing. And the other thing is, in your packs, you have a decision tree. And this is what this significance process is going to follow. I'm going to explain it very briefly, that on the left-hand side, it is a process. Down the middle, with the black arrows, is the actions. And to the right, you'll see how everything interacts with looking at significance and what significance is all about and how you have to assess and evaluate what is important when we're looking at, this could apply to anything to do with traditional buildings, but specifically with windows. So, without further ado, and I'm not going to apologise for most of these buildings being in South or West Wales. So what is it? What is significance about? Why? And to whom? Who is it significant to? Well, significance for our buildings, as I say, is a process. We've got to look at whether we're looking at the whole asset at the building, which should be a starting point. How old is it? Because that might be relevant. What are the materials it's made of? Are they original? Has it been changed over time? Is it replacement? Again, specifically to windows, are they the originals or are they historic replacements? We have to ask these questions as an ongoing process. And those phases of evolution may be important. More of that as we go through. The other thing, once you've identified your building, is you've got to think about its statutory protection. Is it a listed building? Is it in a conservation area or scheduled monument? Or has it got some of those, if you like, lower levels of importance on the statutory side? So is it in a national park, an area of outstanding natural beauty? Is it on a local list? And the one that I'm probably going to repeat more often than I should is setting. People forget about setting a lot. And we see a lot of development where setting hasn't been considered. And I know there are several conservation officers in the room, in fact, two of our own from Carmarthenshire as well. And who cares, really? And I know that I'm preaching to the converted in the room anyway, but is it just the statutory bodies? Is it just those Historic England, CADU, Historic Environment Scotland? Is it just them that care? Is it government? Is it the local authorities? And I'm employed by a local authority, so you'd hope that I do care. Is it just the amenity societies? I know there's a lot of SPAB influence here today. What about your local communities? Do they care, really, about significance, about historic assets? Or is it all of us? Because surely if everybody here lives in and owns a house, isn't it significant to you? Isn't that why you live there? There is a significance to us as individuals for our houses. And then maybe that goes into the windows as well, looking at whether they're significant. Very quickly, just through the grades, grade 1, 2 star and 2. I'm not going to read them off. I'm hoping everybody is aware of those. Is it A, B and C in Scotland, I think? We base our significance on a set of values. Say we, Historic England, CADU, the National Planning Policy Framework and BS 7913 all include these values or a version of them. So we'll look at the evidential value, what's physically there, the remains, the aesthetic or the artistic, which is the evidence that we see in front of our eyes, whether it's whether it's got status, whether we think it's important, what it looks like. Then we've got the historical, and that's associative, what is linked to a person or a movement or an event. Or is it a style of building? Is it a certain industry that's represented by that building? And then there's the final one, the communal, where we have the commemorative. So you think of whether we've got gravestones, whether we've got individuals, got social memories of being somewhere, spiritual, Stonehenge, somewhere like that. All of these have to be looked at as their values when we're looking at significance. And a building can have multiples of these. And I think that it's too easy to focus just on one of these elements. And all buildings will have something of those involved in them. And it may be to a less or greater degree. But we've got to look across the board when we're looking at any building, because this is our starting point. We start with the building, but we will apply these same values to a window, or it could be a door or anything that is associated with that building, especially externally. Now there's a food for thought. The one thing that we don't really mention, and yet it is in the doctrine of the Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act, which doesn't mention significance in it. It uses the word character, enhancing the character or being detrimental to the character of an area or a building. But what makes up character? And I always compare it to people. So all of those people there have status of some form or another because of who they are or what they've done. But what's their character? Individually, what makes up their character? Are they a nice person? Are they kind? Are they cruel? Are they someone who only sleeps for 3 hours a night? That's just the first one. But what would happen if we put a 1970s Afro wig on a certain American president? Would that change his character? It wouldn't change his status. Whatever you think of these individuals, their status is part of them, but what makes them who they are is their character. And I would apply that to our buildings. You've got to delve into the character of what makes the building, or with us specifically this couple of days with the windows, what makes them important? What is it about them that is special? Quite often, and it's great that I'm at the end of the day. Earlier on, I was going to be sort of middle of the day, but it's great that we've heard all of the speakers already talking about the materials, talking about influences. So we've already looked at the Georgian buildings, the townhouse, how it changed, but the symmetry and the actual style of things, and within their setting, how it is makes it what it is as a building. But the one on the left, that Georgian townhouse, which I think is in Tenby, is a classic building because of the windows, because of the shape, the form, the symmetry of those windows are telling us a story. So the character, does anyone know where that is? Dublin, thank you. Well done. It's in how many TV documentaries do you find that street, Henrietta Street in Dublin? But what I like about, I've only been there once, but what I like is the difference. I can't remember how many buildings there are, but they're on both sides of the street. There's probably, a dozen, maybe 15. And they're different. The sashes are different. The actual entrances, the fan lights are all slightly different. So what makes their character? It's not just it's a classic Georgian facade. It's each building, each window has got its own character about it. And this is what we have to look at. We have to assess how important that characterization is to the significance of that building. And the detail. And the devil is in the detail. I know you've all been looking at Charles's evidence, the character that sat outside in the foyer there. So just picking on those two images, you've got a classic Georgian sash window. And I'm going to call it a sliding sash window just because that's me. But you've got the elements on there. Very thin glazing bars. Very thin. I always go to the meeting rail. My first port of call is always that meeting rail. It's really thin. I know this is set behind the reveal, so there's more glass than there is timber showing. But it's the fact that being single glazed, they're faceted, aren't they? They're all reflecting differently. It's all handmade glass. Weirdly enough, 2 weeks ago, I was training someone to repair windows, and he's repaired all these windows on this house already. And just serendipity, I think. And he's done them well. Also, out on the table there were 2 wooden pulleys. That's one of the ones I've seen. That's somewhere in Herefordshire on a private castle. And it's the first one I'd ever seen. It's about 5 or 6 years ago. First one I'd ever seen. And it's exactly the same as the metal boxes, as was already discussed earlier today. Do they inform the character of those windows? Of course they do, because the devil is in the detail. And there we have another one. So you've got I'm going to call them bullions rather than bullseyes. So it's handmade glass, crown glass. Classic, again, Georgian type style. Again, be really careful when you're describing these elements, not to say it's Georgian. I had someone in Llandilo where we work a few years ago talking about a Georgian window, looked just like that, but it was a 6/6. I made it. And my name's not George, and I'm not that old. But it is a Georgian style. And talking to someone recently, I think we can almost take the Georgian style back into the Palladian earlier, and probably to the end of the Victorian period. There is still lots of Georgian styles. It didn't stop when the Georgian kings died. And that's the other wooden pulley that I found on a window last year. It was basically in a skip. And the window itself is very different. So we've had discussions about evolution and age. Now that window I know was 1748. But why is that there? Surely they'd gone beyond. But we're in the middle of Wales. We're in the sort of Cambrian hinterland. Fashion hadn't got there. Development hadn't got there yet. So you've got to be really careful when you're dating and when you're looking, when you have a walk around town later on, aren't we? You've got to think about why that character is still there. The other thing with that is whoever made it, the staff bead on the inside isn't a pinned on piece of timber. It's all in the solid. You can't get the sashes out. So I think it was someone had seen one and got the joinery firm, the local carpenter, to make one. How important does that become? How significant is that now? And more importantly, why was it in a skip? Again, just to reinforce that bit, that in the Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act, it talks about character, doesn't mention significance. And what are we thinking about when we're looking at the character of architectural or historic interest? What are we trying to preserve? Are we trying to preserve the style, the materials, the finishes, age, patina, workmanship? And then you've got all the column on the right. Are we going to be faithful to those mouldings? I have been a conservation officer, and one of my pet hates was applications where the scale drawing was basically something taken out of a historic Scotland pamphlet. And the mouldings and the detail, apart from them being wrong, were not true to that building or that window. But we've had a lot of talk about these materials today, haven't we? We're talking about the glass, the paint, the putty, the mechanisms, the timber itself, the joints used. I'm going to have a conversation at some point about franking joints with people rather than haunched mortise and tenons. But that's a private conversation. But are we preserving just because we should, or are we preserving them because once they're gone, they're gone? How significant are all those elements to any window? And just several slides looking at the style, the design, and those features, which was what we have to look at, because they are what make them special. So we've got anything from a Yorkshire sliding sash, Venetian, semicircular heads, patterned glass, bow windows with curved glass, bow windows with crown glass, bow windows with different size panes. Those details are integral to a building's windows, and those windows are the eyes of that building's soul, as far as I'm concerned, and should be looked after. And I'll give you a little question now, which we'll follow up a little bit later on, and that is, does this only apply to protected buildings? Are we only thinking about listed buildings, conservation areas, etc.? Or are we looking at a bigger picture? And while we're at that, thinking about the bigger picture, are we preserving it for the sake of it, and at what cost? And I'm thinking here of energy use, heat loss. What's the price? Just some more. The Gothic arched window there, it's come from a bishop's palace and is already repurposed, and that was put in 230 odd years ago as a repurposed window. And yes, they're side-hung casements. There's not a straight line in a glazing bar in that window. Does that inform its character? Does that mean it's got significance beyond just the fact it's a repurposed window in basically an outhouse related to an important building? And then we've got the odd ones. So the top middle, they're cast iron. Does that make them more important? Does that make them more significant or less? And going back to the skills, who's going to fix those? I mean, you're just going to get the car filler out like everybody else does. And then you've got a row of 3 different casement windows and the treatments of mullions, or do you have them where they're rebated? Do you change it? So there was a look earlier on today about French windows where they haven't got a mullion. The security on them is awful because you're relying on the outer one with a little rebate, which has usually got like an espagnolet or top and bottom bolts. They're really easy to break into. Having the mullion in between makes them more secure. Do we get rid of that rebated jam and do we put a mullion in place? Have we changed the character by doing that? Now we're looking at something probably slightly more modern, end of the Victorian period, Edwardian, where we start to change the format of our windows. Our sliding sash windows were now being widened, and we have lots more bays. And we've got the Victorians, once they got their bigger panes of glass, cheaper, bigger panes of glass, they then started to embellish. And the Edwardian period carried on. These gorgeous fan lights there. But this is a bit of the elaborate cross window, isn't it? It's been taken a stage further with side-hung casements. Is it significant? That's the question I'm going to keep on asking. And our job, your job, is to assess that significance. And how are you going to do it? How do we assess significance? And there is guidance from CADU, from Historic England, from BS 7913 into how to write a heritage impact assessment. And I've got to promote Wales because it became law in 2016, I think, that you had to write one for listed building or conservation area consent. And England, just for once, has actually had to catch up with that. But the whole point of writing a heritage impact assessment, it's like doing a risk assessment. It's not a tick box exercise. Your job, if you're looking at significance, is to assess what's there, to assess how significant it is, and then think about the changes. How do those changes affect the character and the significance? Are those changes beneficial? Are those changes... Sorry, did that say 15 minutes? Are those changes going to benefit and enhance the building, the windows, the area, or are they going to be detrimental? Again, just some oddities. Unusual. I like the bottom right one, which is a place called Killii in Powys, which at least one person in the room may know. It's owned by Mr. Caps of Caps and Caps. And on an SPAB visit, we were very lucky to see that building. And so it's a Tudor window that's been adapted and had a metal, I'm not going to call it a crittle, but a metal side-hung window inserted into it. That evolution, that change, do we say, well, that's wrong, it should go back to just fixed, fitted diamond leaded lights in it? Or do we say that's part of the evolution? The change has actually enhanced it, and if we alter that, are we causing harm? And again, just some more to do with pulleys, to do with glass evidence. Top left is where either through damage or maybe somebody didn't like having a 6-pane sash, they took all the glazing bars out and put a single pane of glass in. Do we copy that the same? It's a grade 2 stylistic building. Or do we put it back as was? And while we're doing all this, are we looking at how important that crown glass is? And I think it's being reinforced today that crown glass is not available. I believe in reclaiming and recycling. I've got some. No, you can't have it. And the timber, the same. There's a lot of talk about using the correct type of timbers. What's wrong with some salvage timber? I actually repaired a whole window with what was a bay window, an Edwardian bay window. Lovely timber. And it was going to be burnt. The weights. Had a chat with Charles about, I found a stone weight in a box. Well, a pair. Stones with holes tapped through them. How significant are they? How important, how unusual, how rare? But how do you know they're there? And repair or not, and there's already been a discussion about beyond repair and how much you repair, whether you repair the glazing bar. That top left is straight out of the SPAB guidance. I've done one, that's it. What we don't want to see is that. Expanding filler, foam, inappropriate. Well, I don't think I can say much more about that, really. And we've got to look at the condition, obviously, before we make our decisions. We've looked at how significant things are. We've looked at what make up the character of those windows. And then we'll look at the condition. Is it good or very poor or anything in between? And then what are we going to do? We've had 2 wonderful presentations on repairs and on paint and linseed oil putty and not using alien materials. So it's a balance when we're talking now about energy efficiency. Is it repair like for like and just preserve everything and preserve it in aspic and have all our buildings as museums that are losing a lot of energy? Or do we replace? Do we reglaze? Do we secondary glaze? All based on harm or benefit. I've already talked about the heritage impact assessments. Won't go into that. But you do need to look at the level of harm. If you're assessing harm, it's no good to say it's harmful. What I dislike in heritage impact assessments is when somebody says the proposal for some interventions is not going to change anything. Every intervention changes something. It may be unintended consequences. And can you mitigate those elements of harm? Is that something else we can do? Can we improve other ways? And energy efficiency could be one of those. It's beneficial. So the heritage impact will inform what you do, and then you'll produce a method statement, hopefully. I know our conservation officers prefer it if you do. What you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and record it so that the changes are transparent and readable. So let's have a couple of case studies. This is where I run.
So just in a few minutes, I've picked 2 case studies that I'm going to challenge Tom on. They are very, very different. And without further ado, I'm just going to plough into the first one. So we have this first property is grade 2 star listed. I visited this property to do an assessment of the windows. I took Charles Brooking with me.
That's cheating.
So he's familiar with this building. But in summary, it was constructed in the mid-16th century. It has evolved over time with additional ranges added. You can see the windows, possibly not very well on that picture. They are timber-framed single casement windows set within stone mullions. They're not original to the building, given how old it is. Those timber windows are single glazed with very thin panes of glass, very fragile, and they are hung on the original pintle hinges, so there's no subframe, which means they're hugely drafty and causing the owner of the property a real conundrum, as you can imagine, for all the reasons we all know about. So you've got a real dilemma here where these windows we estimate to be in the region of 100 to 120 years old, so late Victorian into the Edwardian era. They are replacement, they're probably drawn sheet glass, but they're not original. So 2 of them were in the 1970s. The bottom left 2 windows were put in the 1970s. So you have a mixture of ages of the replacements, but those replacements are quite old. So I have 2 questions for Tom. Are they significant, and do they add to the character of the building, bearing in mind they're not anything like the originals? Go, Tom.
I'm going to start at the beginning and say, I'm going to go through my process and say, okay, you've identified your building. It's a significant building. In fact, its grade 2 star tells you that already. I'm then going to, you've given the age of the building and something about its status and its evolution, and you've identified the windows. Are you convinced that that is correct, what you've said about the windows and the glass?
Yes.
Okay. Really important that you are. You're not making assumptions that all the windows are the same. So if those windows vary in age, what about the materials that was used? And I'm not talking about the glass yet, I'm just talking about the timber to make the sashes that open or affix, whatever they are. So the ones that are more recent, what condition are they in? Are those ones that are more recent, so this is my experience, that recent 1970s newer joinery fails before anything that's 100 years old or 200 years old. So what is the condition? If the new ones are in a poorer condition, then you would probably be looking at replacing them anyway. But how do the older ones inform the character? They're part of the evolution of that building. They may tell a story. If the sash parts were older, I would say we'd be looking at paint and we'd be looking deeper into the ironmongery. But seeing as they're not, have I got to make this decision?
No.
Good. So what you've got to do is think about, excuse me, you've got to think about individually each window, write a window schedule every time. Have a proper window schedule that you can follow so you can identify, and everyone else knows what window you're talking about. so that you can say these windows are newer, therefore they are less significant than the older ones. Why were they changed? We may never know. What was there before? Are there any other buildings that we can compare to? And then that begs the question, should we return them to a former state? They may have been direct leaded lights, directly glazed. Is that something that we should return to? Because they're probably as leaky and drafty as these are. So with the significance, you've got to have a hierarchy, and that's why window schedule is a great thing to do. I would say the first thing, if I'm looking at energy efficiency, the first thing I'd say with that building is the proportion of the window sizes to the wall as part of the building's envelope. If you've got big windows, they form a bigger proportion to the envelope, so the glass is losing more heat. When you've got relatively small windows, their heat loss is not as significant maybe as the masonry heat loss. So that's something to build into your decision making. Do not jump to assumptions. I really love that drawing that we used to get in college and university of a house that all the heat loss, 25% from windows, etc. So you're going to do further investigation and analyse. And I'm going to leave that there.
Thank you.
And you're going to now go for another one, aren't you?
So this is the polar opposite end of the scale. Not listed, but very importantly, conservation area, small village in Oxfordshire. These three buildings were originally 6 cottages, late Victorian. On the right-hand side, original windows, 2/2s. The middle, replacement windows, double glazed, very recent, done as decent replicas of the original. And the ones on the left have been changed completely to 1/1s. However, they are replacing a previous replacement that were casements, opening casements. So they've gone back to a sash, but an inappropriate design. So my question is this. The two that have been replaced, no consent was sought. The middle one, has done a like for like. So notionally, in a conservation area, you are allowed to replace like for like without consent. However, if the like isn't appropriate in the first place, if the original one is a replacement, you can't do a like for like. So is the like for like rule appropriate? Do we value a normal Victorian, early Edwardian sash because of its decent timber and its old glass? Or are we ready just to discard those in the name of energy efficiency? And my third question is, we need to look at conservation area appraisals to make sure that we don't get this in our conservation areas in terms of terraces where all the windows are changed. Do you agree? Quickly.
3 questions there, very quickly. Wow. Original conservation area, it has a beneficial impact on the conservation area. How much negative impact is there from the other windows, from the similar ones to the ones that are totally different? And if we were going to improve, what are we trying to improve? Are we trying to improve energy efficiency, or are we trying to improve aesthetic, or are we trying to return it to something as on the right-hand one? And your assessment will be what benefit or what harm, and you balance. That was the scales earlier on. You're balancing one against the other. What I don't know from this is setting. Is there a scheduled monument opposite on the other side of the road? Is there a listed building opposite? Because if there is, would, for instance, I'm going to go right into some detail, by double glazing, are you now getting more of a reflection back onto a listed building? Are you impacting on the character of another building, not just this one? It's got to be looked at. It's part of the consideration. Just as in the conservation area, if that's all this was and it was a modern terrace or nothing on the other side of the road, I think it would be quite straightforward to consider alternatives. And we can't go back retrospectively, but if The left-hand end wanted to replace those with the ones that are in the middle, which are similar but actually more energy efficient. That would probably be a good compromise. There's probably enough mitigation there to do that. And I'm waiting for some conservation officers to throw bricks at me.
Right. Thanks for it. Let's show our appreciation for Tom and Laura for that.